When Andy Granatelli died in 2013, he was eulogized in the New York Times and several sports periodicals as a colorful man who had left his mark on motorsports history. Involved with cars from a young age, the race that would dominate most of his attention was the so-called greatest spectacle in racing, the Indianapolis 500, where some of the most famous drivers ever to drive that track raced in his cars. On the way, he would make a name for himself both on and off the track, showing his flair for the dramatic, the persistent, and the ingenuitive. And all that was all the more impressive because he started with almost nothing. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Andy Granatelli was born March 18, 1923 in Dallas, Texas, but he grew up poor in Chicago. His mother died when he was 12, and he and his brothers would drop out of school at a young age to help support the family. He worked low-paying jobs at first, but by 20, he and his brothers Joe and Vince bought a gas station on the north side of Chicago that they dubbed Andy's Super Service, which provided gas and mechanic services. Andy's penchant for showmanship was obvious even then as he turned his gas station into a production. Instead of just working on the cars, he envisioned a kind of a pit crew-style station where a whole crew of mechanics would work on the car at the same time. The concept proved immediately popular and novel, as customers would wait in lines a block long to have a chance to watch their car being treated like a race car. At this time, he and his brothers became known for tinkering with engines and cars, and in 1945 started Grancore Automotive Specialist, Grancore standing for Granatelli Corporation. Soldiers coming back from the war were looking for things to do, and hot rod racing and hopping up their cars became a common hobby. According to Andy, they couldn't get the West Coast hot rod parts makers to sell them enough products. I told them, "You guys are missing the boat on all this. You should be making this stuff by the truckload." But none of them would do it, so I started making my own heads and intakes. Grancore parts would become famous in the industry, and they began selling these high-performance parts to retailers all over the Midwest. The brothers also started modifying existing equipment, such as flathead Ford engines, which they marketed locally as Grancore Fords. They installed the Cadillac overhead valve V8 into new 1949 Fords and called those Fordillacs, which they sold for $3,800. This may have been one of the ways that the Granatellis first entered the world of racing. Daytona Beach had become one of the most popular places in the world to beat land speed records. Many of the racers there had begun as whiskey transporters who ran moonshine during Prohibition and even after, and had been upgrading their cars to avoid authorities. Another reason Andy began promoting racing was simple business. He sold racing parts, and racers helped build a market for them. The Warriors were lean for racing. The Indianapolis Speedway was shut down. Many drivers were away serving in the military, and things like fuel oil and rubber were rationed. Interested in racing at a time when racing was difficult, Andy decided to found his own organization, and in 1947 founded the Hurricane Racing Association, which ran races at Soldiers Field in Chicago. He single-handedly created a series of hot rod and stock car races that raced across the Midwest in Illinois and Wisconsin, and attracted an all-time record crowd of 89,560 fans into Soldiers Field. He'd already become a wizard of promotion, advertising his first drag race at Half Day Speedway, which was originally Half Day Naval Outlying Field, used as an emergency landing strip for a nearby naval air station, as the first nationally advertised drag race. He brought in 26,000 race fans, when across the country at California, drag strips could only attract 1,500. In his autobiography, he also described the theatrics of some of these early races, which included drivers who were experts at surviving dramatic rollover crashes to the delight of spectators. He also drove a rocket car at state fairs and elsewhere, billing himself as Antonio the Great. In 1946, the Granatelli brothers purchased a Ford V8 Miller, originally built for the 1935 Indy 500, installed a new engine with a Grancore head, and drove it to Indianapolis from Chicago to be the first Grancore-sponsored car in the race. Driven by Danny Cladis, the car qualified 33rd and ran 46 laps before the car lost power immediately after a pit stop. The team towed the car through the infield and discovered that the fuel switch, which had been turned off during pit stops, hadn't been turned back on. The car was still race-ready, but officials determined that it had left the race course and was out of the race. They officially finished in 21st place. The Granatellis entered two cars in 1947 and finished 12th at 167 laps. According to Andy, he had squeezed out some extra laps through a little bit of trickery. The car was running low on oil, and the rule at the time was that no oil could be added, so Andy added water to the system to get a few more laps out of the car before it had to retire from the race. In 1948, Andy attempted to qualify for the race for his first and last time, wearing a helmet he borrowed from his friend Bill France, the founder of NASCAR. Andy himself would be vice chairman of NASCAR for a time. He crashed during qualifying and was seriously injured, even losing 11 teeth. Granatelli continued to enter cars in the following years. In 1950, Pat Flair qualified in a Granatelli car, and Andy convinced Clark Gable to pose with the crew in post-qualification photos. In 1952, a Granatelli car finished second, and another finished fourth in 1953. In 1952, Andy declared that we could have won this race, we could have won it, and someday we will win it. In 1954, the Grand Corps car was bumped from the race, and Andy decided that he was going to protest by no longer entering cars in the Indy 500. While he continued attending the race, he didn't enter cars again until 1961. The brothers sold Grand Corps in 1957, and in 1958, Andy and brother Joe brought Paxton Products, which was losing money developing superchargers. Within 7 months, the Granatellis had turned the business around, turning Andy into an in-demand player in the engineering and production industry. In 1961, Paxton Products was sold to Studebaker, and Andy became the vice president, chief of performance engineering, chief driver, and chief engineer at Studebaker. Working at Studebaker, his production cars would set more than 400 land speed and endurance records. Shortly before, Studebaker had also acquired a small company called STP, standing for Scientifically Treated Petroleum. Studebaker had briefly marketed STP as Studebaker Tested Products, but Studebaker President Sherwood Egbert tapped Granatelli as CEO of Chemical Compounds, which produced STP, thinking the product had a promise to become extremely profitable. And he would market it as the Racer's Edge. His leadership at STP coincided with a return to the Brickyard in Indianapolis. Before the 1961 racing season, Granatelli purchased the rights to the Novi engine. The Novi had first been used at the Brickyard in 1941 and proved to be an incredibly powerful but difficult-to-control engine. It had a characteristic scream that, thanks to a gear-driven centrifugal supercharger as well as an oversized valve design, gave it a louder, deeper roar. In 1948, Ralph Hepburn died driving a Novi, and racer Chet Miller died in practice driving a Novi in 1953. The engine was famous, or infamous, for being incredibly powerful, but dangerous. Andy brought his own ingenuity to the engine, developing a four-wheel drive version that was meant to better harness the engine's power. The last version used by Granatelli's STP Novi had an output of 837 brake horsepower. In 1961, the Novi looked like a legitimate threat, but its crankshaft broke, and so the car failed to qualify. In 1962, he brought two Novis, which again failed to qualify, but in 1963, Andy finally succeeded when 3 of his Novis qualified. One was driven by then-rookie Bobby Unser, who would go on to win the Indianapolis 500 3 times. Unser was out of the race in lap 3 after crashing into a wall. The second car went out with clutch problems after 18 laps. Jim Hurtubise ran for a second time in the last Novi until he was forced to drop out thanks to an oil leak, taking 22nd place. All 3 cars qualified again in 1964, and 2 of them in 1965, but only in 1964 did one actually complete the race, coming in 11th. The Novis weren't the only thing he brought to Indianapolis in the 60s. What would prove to make Granatelli the most famous was his tireless promotion of STP. The cars that STP sponsored were STP Red, a brilliant orange-red color that would become famous in motorsports. And he starred in his own commercials, had his pit crew wear suits covered in STP logos, and even wore a logo-covered suit. His personality was part of the product, a callback, as Sports Illustrated said in 1968, to the days when peddlers sold their own celery tonic from Conestoga wagons. The STP logo became a phenomenon as he made literally millions of STP stickers. In 1968, Sports Illustrated estimated that 28 million cars had an STP sticker, and he handed them out everywhere. The stickers became so ubiquitous on skateboards, cars, and clothing that some joked in 1969 that when the astronauts landed on the moon, they'd find an STP sticker already there. But whatever Andy Granatelli did, the Indy 500 called him, just like Melville's Moby Dick. In 1966, Andy joined forces with Lotus Cars Limited, a British car company, and finished second with driver Jim Clark. There remained some controversy over the possibility the lap was miscounted, as the second Lotus car looked nearly identical to Clark's. Clark returned in 67 with a similar car, but another STP entry was even more interesting. Driven by Parnelli Jones, Granatelli entered a 4-wheel drive vehicle powered by a turbine engine originally built for helicopters, called the STP Paxton Turbo Car, which he also called the Whooshmobile or Silent Sam. Jones went on to dominate the race, leading for 171 laps. By lap 196, Jones was far ahead of the second place, and Andy could quite literally see the finish line and his trophy. But then suddenly the turbine car lost power and rolled to a stop. A cheap bearing had failed, and Jones was out. In 1967, STP was a regular sponsor of The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, and Carson rode in the Parnelli turbine car during a segment that fall. Granatelli was a guest several times on the show as well and aired his famous raincoat commercials at the Brickyard, showing off STP's lubrication qualities. In one famous commercial, Granatelli dipped a screwdriver in STP and asked Rocky Marciano, the undisputed world heavyweight boxing champion, to grip it with his thumb and forefinger, and it would always slip right out of his grasp. In 1968, Andy entered 11 cars in the race. Actually, some of these cars didn't even exist, but entering was cheap, and it meant that STP's name appeared all over the printed entry lists. 4 of the cars were wedge-shaped turbine cars built by Lotus. 3 qualified, and they took the first 2 positions. One of the turbine cars looked good throughout most of the race, leading its way up into lap 191, a stone's throw from victory. And for the second year in a row, a turbine car failed in the final stretch. After the race, new rules were implemented that didn't outright ban turbine cars, but effectively made them uncompetitive, despite Granatelli's protests. Granatelli's bad luck at the track was obvious. In 1969, he ran 3 new Lotus-designed cars. Mario Andretti drove one and crashed it during a qualifying, burying his face. Andretti would qualify instead in a backup car, the Bronner Hawk. The race was hard fought, and Andretti had his share of close calls. On his final pit stop, his car nearly stalled, and he knocked over the chief mechanic. The car held on, taking first place. Andy Granatelli had a habit of kissing his drivers on the cheek, and the photo of Granatelli kissing Andretti has become an iconic photo of the Speedway.
Well, I tell you what, that kiss was actually welcome. I keep saying I still smell the garlic, but it was okay.
His wheeling and dealing brought him his fair share of detractors and admirers, but he didn't seem concerned about it. Continued to be lavish, outspoken, and visible. People say he's flamboyant, he's this, he's that, Granatelli said in 1969. That's just me. I can't help who I am. I was born supercharged. Another STP-sponsored car would win at Indy in 1973, and in 1972 he struck a deal with Richard Petty, the King, a NASCAR racer, becoming one of the first national sponsors of a NASCAR racing team. The deal had its own drama, as Andy wanted the car painted STP red, while Petty wanted to maintain the blue he had always raced with. The compromise included both colors. It became a famous color combination in its own right. The STP sponsorship of Petty, and after he retired his racing team, is one of the longest-standing sponsor relationships in the history of NASCAR. Despite ill luck at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, Granatelli's work in business was more unqualifiably successful. He turned STP into a household name used by millions. Less than a decade, transforming a company with $2 million in sales into one with $100 million in sales. The company was spun off in 1969, but majority shareholder Studebaker stepped away in 1973 after disagreements with STP's directors. In 1982, he drove a street-legal Camaro more than 241 miles an hour on a test track. I wanted the world to know that you are never too old to do something you want to do, he said. He left STP in the 70s as well, though he continued to attend the Indy 500, where his eternal and conspicuous presence earned him the title, Mr. 500. Andy Granatelli passed away in December 2013 at the age of 90. It is believed that he attended every Indianapolis 500 from 1946 to 2012, although he had to miss 2013 due to ill health. J. Douglas Bowles, president of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, said that Andy understood better than anyone the spirit and challenge of the Indianapolis 500. He leaves a legacy of historic moments that will live forever in Indianapolis 500 lore. Andy Granatelli was inducted into 24 business and racing halls of fame for his many years of work in motorsports. And while he was famous for many things, after his death his son said of him that the thing that gave him the most gratification in life was what he did at the Indianapolis 500. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history. And if you did enjoy, feed the algorithm by making a comment or clicking that like button. If you have suggestions for future episodes, please send those to our suggestions email box. Check out our webpage at thehistoryguy.net. And of course, we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo and check out our merchandise at teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes of Forgotten History, all you need to do is subscribe.
Pictures in Victory Lane, are you giving Mario a great big smooch?
Right, why not?
I don't see anything wrong with it.
Here we are 33 years later, you're talking about it.
Yeah. It's one of those things that you remember. Was that a spur of the moment thing?
Well, of course. I mean, what else can you do? He's Italian, I'm Italian. I was happy. Hell, it took me 21 years to win the race. Why not?